All right, let's jump right into this explainer because today we are tackling something absolutely mind-bending. We're going to mathematically deduce exactly how something comes from, well, nothing. And look, we're not just going to sit around and philosophize here. We are diving into the strict foundational mathematics that literally force reality into existence. We're going to derive the structural gap of the universe from a state of absolute zero. And we'll see how the origin of binary numbers, time, and motion are all strict, unavoidable consequences of just one single operational rule. It's a wildly fascinating journey, so let's get into it. Okay, let's dive into this outline really quick. We're going to systematically climb from the absolute bottom of reality all the way up to the mechanics of motion. So we'll start with the absolute ground state, move to the mandate of change, explore the genesis of distinction, check out the Möbius parity twist, and finally wrap up with the inescapable gap velocity. Starting off with section 1, the absolute ground state, which you'll often hear called the void. This is the starting point of our logical journey, a pre-geometric baseline mathematically defined as absolute absence. Now, to understand reality, you really have to understand what it's built on. In the source material, this baseline is called C0, or the wash. And actually, scratch the idea of a sterile, hollow container just waiting to be filled. That's not what this is. It's more like a fully balanced computational ledger. It represents a state of total global connection where all relations and spatial directions are perfectly symmetric. Basically, every local signal cancels out against its exact counterpart. And because of that extreme connectivity, it is physically read at the local level as absolute absence. And this brilliantly illustrates the mathematical structure of that void. Think of it modeled as a complete graph on n nodes, where every single node connects to every other node perfectly. When you look at the Laplacian matrix for this, which is basically a way to measure how nodes differ from their neighbors, you get exactly two vibrational modes. The zero mode means the whole system shifts together as one monolithic block, so internal local measurement is totally impossible. Then you have the N mode, which represents this extreme macroscopic connectivity, a flat band of maximal stiffness. The system is so tightly coupled that any internal variance is neutralized instantly. So mathematically, the vacuum is this intensely coupled, maximally connected structure that just folds onto a single indistinguishable readout. So that leaves us with a really crucial question. If the void is this perfectly balanced, unchangeable, massively stiff graph, how on earth does a perfect void obey the mandate to change? Well, that brings us right to section 2, the mandate of change, or constraint 1. This is the supreme rule that completely shatters that absolute symmetry of the wash. Constraint 1, or C1, is literally the thermodynamic engine of this entire framework. It dictates one simple thing. All things must change. Every admissible state in the universe must possess a distinct legal successor. And this doesn't just mean standing still is illegal. It means stasis is structurally non-existent. If a state can't change, it's not a coordinate in the substrate. It literally lacks membership in the state space of reality altogether. You can't pause, you can't freeze, absolute fixed points do not exist. And because C1 strictly forbids these fixed points, it demands that the phase space of the universe must support a nowhere vanishing vector field. If you look at differential topology, specifically the Poincaré-Hopf theorem, which basically says you can't comb a hairy sphere flat without creating a cowlick or a point of stasis, well, this mathematically proves that the Euler characteristic of the universe must be exactly zero. The universe absolutely cannot be a static geometric container filled with resting states. It is actively forced into continuous, measure-preserving dynamical evolution. Moving on to section 3, the genesis of distinction. Here's where we look at the collision. I mean, we've got a perfect void, and we've got a supreme mandate that forbids stasis. So what happens when you force a mandate of change onto a void that can't change? Well, you get a collision. The absolute void is the ultimate fixed point, right? It has no internal difference, so it can't sequentially transition. But remember, C1 executes any state lacking a legal successor, so the void actively fails to hold still. And this failure produces the gap, the foundational interstice. Because a single self-identical unit with no complement would be a forbidden fixed point under C1, the very first foundational distinction has to possess two asymmetric sides, meaning the integer 2 is actually the absolute baseline floor of reality. The concept of 1 only exists afterward as a single abstracted side of a pre-existing dual relationship. How wild is that? Now, what's really interesting here is how we can visualize this mathematically. Imagine a boundary walk on a geometric surface. On side A, a cylinder with an offset of 0, The walk just loops indefinitely on a single face. There is no distinction, which means stasis, and under C1, that is dead and forbidden. But on side B, we introduce the interstice. That shifts the topology to a Möbius strip with an offset of 1. Now the boundary walk is forced to visit both faces in sequence over a period of 2n. This single topological shift converts an inaccessible second side into a serially readable distinction. It's a real game changer. Let's take a closer look at this mechanism in section 4, the Möbius parity twist. We really need to understand the exact mechanical action that generates the very first bit of information in the universe. So let's walk through this topological cycle surgery step by step. First, you traverse the spatial cell, and inevitably, you hit the topological seam, that foundational gap. Hitting the seam forces a parity twist on the face coordinate. This is an operation mapped mathematically as face XOR 1, an absolute binary toggle. Because you've executed this XOR flip, the walk now reads the opposite side. Over 2n steps, both faces are read serially. So this exact mechanical action literally serializes a superposition into a readable temporal sequence. I want to pause here just to really appreciate this. The first distinction cannot be a lone mark. A mark with no complement is completely indistinguishable from no mark at all. It fundamentally requires two sides. This topological XOR flip, this binary transition, is what births time itself. Difference isn't just some added ingredient in this universe. Difference is the absolute precondition of change. Okay, so we have this dynamic gap boundary successfully generating sequential time and distinction. But that raises a pretty terrifying mathematical question. What happens to this newly formed gap boundary if it ever stops moving? And that brings us to our final deduction in section 5, the inescapable gap velocity. We're going to see exactly how this initial binary distinction expands into continuous, mandatory physical motion. The architecture we're looking at strictly employs what's called a dual-wave formalism. Basically, the universe is not a static geometric entity. It is a continuously moving, phase-localized oscillation operating right at the Planck frequency. The gap we've been talking about is located exactly at the interface, where the computational substrate's active asking state and reactive answering state have perfectly equal absolute magnitudes. Reality is tracking right on that boundary. So the crucial point is this derived formula for the physical translation of the gap. If we look at the phase domain, where those two active and reactive states are equal, and we take the temporal derivative to find where the total phase change is 0, we get the velocity of the gap, dx over dt equals negative omega L over k. This equation right here is the literal mathematical engine of inevitability. Let's look at what actually happens if that velocity ever hits 0. If the gap boundary stops moving, the math requires one of three catastrophic conditions. Either omega is 0, which means absolute cessation of temporal progression, time stops completely, or L is 0, which is the complete structural collapse of spatial extent, or we hit an undefined infinite phase singularity. Every single one of these scenarios violently violates the C1 mandate. Because absolute fixed points are strictly forbidden, the substrate geometry mathematically forces this gap boundary to oscillate continuously. It is mathematically barred from ever freezing. We've seen how nothing is forced to become something simply because it is mathematically disallowed from holding still. The universe is a continuous execution of change. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. If absolute stasis means the structural collapse of space and time themselves, what exactly is the universe calculating in its mandatory next step? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll catch you next time.